And welcome again to Contemporary Moral Issues. I'm Professor Borrowdale, and we're going to finish up talking about capitalism and socialism today, and then we'll be talking a bit about healthcare and reviewing for the exam. So I have the week 9 readings up on healthcare. There's just a handful of them. There's one handout that's a little, 13 pages. It's a little longer than the others. Some of the readings are from the time that the some of the readings are that we had. Some of them were from the time of the Obama administration, and so they're at a time where people were trying to drum up votes for, or the Democrats were trying to drum up votes for the Affordable Care Act, ACA, aka Obamacare. And so it hits on a lot of the philosophical issues about whether health care is a right, whether it ought to be provided by the government. So I got a reading from Bernie Sanders there, who's arguing for a kind of something that goes farther than the Affordable Care Act as having government-supported health care, along with some criticisms of the Obamacare situation and a little bit about the Trump care replacement that's still working through its way through Congress. We had something that sort of came up that was kind of in between Obamacare and what's being called Trump care now. That was too weak, and basically the conservative Republicans balked at it, that it was basically Obamacare light. And so now they're back to the drawing board and they got something else that they're trying to pass, so we'll see what happens. You'd think people have this sort of view that, oh, well, the Republicans control both houses of Congress and the presidency, therefore whatever they propose will just go sailing through because they don't need any Democrat votes. But the Republican Party is not a monolithic party, so you have a lot of centrist and even liberal Republicans. You have a small number of conservative Republicans that can block things and cause trouble. You got the voters who will get angry, and people worry about blowback from the voters if they pass something that's perceived as being too liberal. So there are lots of different things going on with that, and it's still in process. So I just posted a piece that was back from January on some of the ideas, along with some proposals from various commentators, including yours truly, a modest healthcare proposal about some things that would help bring down prices and cover more people and so on. Let's see. Let's get started right here. Make sure I hit the right one. Okay. See all my junk from previous terms here. This is one class that's very time intensive as far as prep goes. Just because of the, is that the right one? Let's see. Maybe I need to do the media server. Let me just make sure I got the right one. You have to update things. Like the national debt last time I did this class was like 18 trillion. Now it's 20 trillion. I think for a while I was under 5 trillion because I hadn't updated the numbers. So lots of things changed. We did, I remember doing the war on drugs and talking about marijuana legalization. Well, it's already happened, right? At least here in Oregon. So a lot of this current events stuff, it's tough to keep up with. It's not like teaching Plato, where it's pretty much Plato doesn't really change. Allegory of the Caves, same stuff. Okay. Yeah, this is the one. Okay. Scroll down to where we're at. Oh, so I kind of wrote out a lot of this stuff because I think it's, if I just have keywords on there, maybe it doesn't get through as much. So I want to hit these contrasts between capitalism and socialism. And we live, so you shouldn't think about these as either or. It's sort of in a spectrum. So a capitalist system has virtually no regulations or rules imposed by government on commerce. A socialist system, you have the government controlling commerce in a centralized fashion. So basically, government bureaucrats either largely or entirely decide how things go. And I suppose in the kind of the Marxist, the more pure Marxist system, it's all like worker cooperatives and maybe a little more decentralized, although in practice that never happens, except for maybe if you have a commune like of 100 people. Communes generally, they'll work about 50 to 100 people, they're doable, but it's not really scalable. So you try to do communism or socialism on a national scale, things start breaking down. So last time I was talking about, and this is, I think is really worth pointing out here, this idea of the gun in the room. That people think about socialism as being sort of a kinder and gentler way of doing things. They think about socialist people as saying, hey, let's all work together for a common purpose. And the idea is that if you're a refusenik, if you don't want to go along with the program, you must be like a greedy capitalist bastard. You want to hoard all your wealth for yourself. You hate poor people. And I think that, again, conflates this idea of government with society. So, and people who generally, this is not all people, but people that generally support free market ideas also support, generally speaking, charitable giving and generosity. We've actually done studies of people giving by political ideology. And it turns out that the conservatives tend to give a lot more money of their personal wealth to others. They tend to be big on charitable giving. And they even give bigger tips. And the people that give the least to charity tend to be people that believe in big government programs, people that identify as strongly ideologically liberal. So, and I think their idea is, well, I gave at the office. That's what the government is there for. The government's there to help people, and me, I'm just some schmo trying to get by. And so I'll pay as little as possible, and I don't really have any leftover money. I have my expenses. I have my hobbies. I deserve to enjoy myself. Taxes are when the government takes money from me to help people, and charity is just something you might do once in a blue moon. Whereas the conservatives think government ought to be really small, and they think it's a matter of personal responsibility for helping people. And some libertarians too, although libertarians, I think, we're kind of the outlier, and they're a small percentage of the population anyway. So let's see. I think as I remember this particular study I was looking at, the libertarians were more like Mr. Pink from the Reservoir Dogs. It's like, why do I have to be Mr. Pink? I don't believe in tipping. It costs what it costs. Why should I pay extra? Anyway, this idea of socialism should be distinguished from personal charity, and even things like before the big welfare state, there used to be these benevolent associations people would join. So it was kind of like a form of social insurance. This is before Social Security too. So you would join a benevolent association, and you pay your dues every month. It wasn't very much. It was largely made of immigrant groups, and then and some of them were based on like immigrant identity, racial or national identity, national origin, I guess, and but not all of them. Some of them were religiously based. Some were just fraternal orders, and people would pay in a certain amount every month, and then if somebody got sick or they lost their job, they'd be taken care of. It's sort of like a church with all the religious mumbo jumbo. Right? Some of them were religiously based, but some were completely secular. And this was a form of, like, you might say, mutualism or mutual cooperation that didn't involve the government at all and took care of a lot of poor people, and was a form of insurance in case somebody fell on hard times. And now the government has co-opted the insurance, charity. It sort of takes over these things, and then people think, well, the government will take care of it. But the difference between charitable giving or mutual help or even having a job in the so-called private sector, aka real businesses not run by the government, is the difference between voluntary and involuntary. And so the argument I made from a moral point of view is that if you're going to point a gun in somebody's face and say pay up, you better have a damn good reason for needing the money. And what is that? What would be a morally acceptable reason for extorting money from somebody by force? Well, a possible reason, and I'm not even sure about this one, but it seems like a possible reason, which might even float. You can't just say, well, I got this good thing I want to do, right? I have this thing that's going to make the world a better place. It seems like anything you would say that doesn't, first of all, it doesn't directly affect that person, and second of all, isn't something that's like a vital, important interest, would not suffice. So basically, the idea is that, well, we're forcing money out of you because if we don't, we'll be invaded by marauding bands of nomads from wherever. We'll be taken over by the commies, or there'll be chaos in the streets and people will be breaking out the store windows and taking all the stuff, and there won't be any law and order, and people won't be safe walking down the street. And you get this in some areas. There used to be, before government was very strong and powerful, you would have, just walking down the road, it would be like, everyone was like Chicago, right? Certain parts of Chicago, I guess, right? But there are neighborhoods in America where you aren't safe walking down the street. So there's some in Eugene that are like that, where you're taking your life in your hands, your property at least. And so the idea is, well, government at least has to be there to protect you, to keep civil order, to protect you from foreign invasion. So it sort of has this public safety, national defense function. But then when you start going beyond that and you start talking about maybe infrastructure, it's kind of iffy. And then you start thinking about things that can be provided by regular businesses without stealing money from people. If it can be done, most people would balk if they said, well, everybody needs shoes, so the government should make shoes. People would say, well, that's a stupid idea, right? But then they'll say, well, but education, you need education. But which you need better, like shoes on your feet or education? Or housing, right? Everybody needs a house to live in. Well, the government only provides housing to the very poor. So what would happen if the government provided housing to everybody? Well, probably everybody would be living the projects, and life would suck for everybody. I suppose they could go, this sort of communist revolution idea is go demolish all the nice houses, or maybe the government bureaucrats party members get to live in the nice houses, and then you just demolish all the tract homes and just build housing projects and make people move into those. Anyway, so that's the voluntary versus involuntary. So national defense and public safety, it seems at least you can pitch an argument. And this is what John Locke does in his second treatise. He says, look, here's a justification for government. Government is there to keep the social order, to protect people, to protect people's life, liberty, and property from foreign invaders and from domestic criminals. And also have a court system to keep people from taking the law into your own hands. That assumes a government system. To keep people from exacting revenge, perpetrating acts of violence on people they have disputes with. So the idea is you go into court, you present your evidence to a judge, and then the judge will make a ruling one way or another, and you don't get blood feuds over property or personal disputes. And it seems like those are fairly defensible, but anything beyond that, it starts to look more and more tenuous, given the violent nature of government. So the difference between capitalism and socialism, and capitalism I talked about, it produces goods and services that to offer you on a voluntary basis, and socialism takes money from you and gives you services that some of which you might like, some of which you might not like. I'm sure everyone in this room could find things they would have a gripe about that they get, and probably some things that they like. But the question is, like, if you were to buy that in the open market, how much would it cost you? Probably it would cost less than it would cost the government to make things. Because one of the things about government is very inefficient at producing things. Let's get back to that in a minute. So in capitalism, individuals own the means of production. So Marx had this idea, well, it was only when the workers own the means of production. Well, any worker in the United States can start their own business. I just talked to a student the other day. She has a food cart at the Saturday market. She's her own person. Now, the government puts a bunch of burdens on you that keep people from doing that. So you go to an employer, they give you some papers to fill out, and if you have some problems, they'll maybe help you out with it. And the paperwork's not too bad. You start a business, and you got a bunch of paperwork to fill out, taxes become complicated, and the bigger the business, the more problems you have, and it's just a big disincentive. And you're taking a huge risk, and the government doesn't make it much easier. There are a few things like the Small Business Association and some other things that sort of help people out. But like say you're a little girl and you want to have a lemonade stand, right? So you set up your little lemonade stand to make some money, maybe for a trip to Disneyland or something. Like some government bureaucrat is going to come and say you're violating the health code. And this happened actually up in Portland. And this little girl with her lemonade stand was told she needed to get a permit for the city that would cost her $300, which is way more than she would have ever been able to make with her little lemonade stand. That's your tax dollars of work if you live in the city of Portland, and that's the city of Portland keeping you safe. And the government has all kinds of licensing regulations about, like if you want to do like nails and hair, right? So there's the case of this woman. She was doing like the kind of cornrows you see as often in the African American community, although it's widespread and a lot of people are doing it. I don't know whether that's cultural appropriation or not, but a lot of people of all colors they like the cornrows and the sort of certain style of African American hair braiding. And so this woman was doing that, and she was told, "Hey, you need a license to do that." And she's like, "A license? Why do I need a license to do people's hair? Oh, it's the government requires it." And it turns out there was like a beauty school in town, and they lobbied the legislature, and maybe it was a group of beauty schools. I can't remember the exact story, but basically the beauty school required a cosmetology license to do nails and hair, and they say, "There's toxic chemicals. It could be dangerous. You could spread fungus." And so you have to go to beauty school and shell out, $10,000 or $20,000 to be able to do people's hair for $12 an hour or whatever to start, right? So, and there's just so many of these rules and regulations that keep people from engaging in commerce at an individual level, push people into becoming wage slaves, working for a boss. And then the government schooling system does the same thing, where it sort of has obedience to authority, follow the rules, get good grades on the test, don't talk to your neighbor, sit up straight. The sort of it basically socializes people into falling into a hierarchy instead of being kind of rabble-rousers and going out and doing their own thing. And with the caveat that, well, you gotta make sure you don't hurt people, and you gotta make sure that you're doing things safely and prudently. And what happens if you don't do that? Well, maybe people don't buy your product anymore. So maybe a lot of that could be fall under the buyer beware. I just had that. And this idea of crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is really a misnomer, because pure capitalism, doesn't have any of this cronyism. So in pure capitalism, the government has no control of the economy at all. And you might think, well, the government's keeping us safe from the excesses of capitalism. But actually what happens is as soon as you give politicians control of the economy, what they do is they take money to get elected from big corporations in order to screw the competition, right? So those corporations say, well, if I had to compete in the open market, that's really tough. My prices would go down. I have to have better selection. I have to have better product. I'm constantly worried about being undercut by these these smaller, more agile businesses, what the hell do I do? Oh, I'll go, I got my boy in Washington, he's gonna pass a tariff against foreign competitors. He's gonna pass some licensing regulation or something else that's gonna give me preferential treatment and screw my competitors. Or I'm gonna get a big fat tax subsidy for my industry. So all these things are cronyism, and as I like to say, crony capitalism is phony capitalism. So if there's government involvement, that's actually more of a socialistic or a fascistic system. Of Tax Freedom Day, I'm not sure what day it is, but if you look at the day the average taxpayer stops working for the government and starts working for himself, it usually falls around April. Maybe it's, I'm not sure where it is this year. When I did this last year, it was April 12th. So it's about tax day, right? So this is the average, right? So a lot of people in this room might be getting money back from the government more than they paid in. There might be a few people that have to pay a little bit, but there's also people who've been working, like they're near retirement age, who make a whole lot and the government takes a whole lot. So it really depends on the person, but the average time. So if you think your average middle class person is working at least maybe lower middle class, depends on whether you're counting federal income taxes or all the taxes, because there's state taxes, there's licensing, like your vehicle licensing, so there's all kinds of taxes you pay directly and indirectly. So if you consider, let's just say a third, imagine this idea that as a middle class person, you're working at least a third of the time, you're just working for the government. And do you get a third of your wages back in help from the government? Would be a question you might want to ask yourself. This is an old chart here. I think I've got a more recent one in the readings. But you look at this before the big collapse. So the top 1% are paying 38% of all the total amount of federal taxes. And you look at the bottom 50%, they're only paying about 3%. I think this number has actually gotten smaller, where the bottom 50% are paying is almost close to zero, and this top 1% has gone up a little bit. But you look at where is most of the money coming from? Well, most of it's coming from, I'd say the top 25%. And the top 50% are paying the lion's share, and the bottom 50% are paying nothing. And you look at the numbers here, it's not, especially like you look at, you think, well, $67,000, that's a lot of money to me as a poor starting student. But if you're just doing some blue collar job in some urban area, you might just be barely getting by. It's just two parents making 30 grand, and depending on what your cost of living is. So anyway, the main point is that the rich pay most of the largest portion of taxes already, and the poor pay almost nothing when it comes to federal taxes, which leads to what they call entitlement creep, which is that the vast majority of people who aren't paying any taxes vote for more programs because they're not paying for them. And since they outnumber the rich people, they tend to get passed by the politicians. Now, rich people, I suppose, can give away more money to politicians, but that only goes so far. And they basically they got to count the votes, and so the votes are what determine it. And they know that they can basically bribe people. They can say, "Oh, well, if you vote for me, I'll give you all this stuff from this other guy over here. See this rich bastard over here? He's got more than you. And you know what? You deserve some of that stuff. And I'll give it to you if you just vote for me. I'll tax him to the hilt. I'll soak the rich, and then I'll be like Santa Claus. I'll just be doling the money away to people." I think Thomas Sowell had this quote where he said, the welfare state is the oldest con in the book. You take away people's money quietly and give it away, give some of it back to them flamboyantly. So politicians make a big show when they give away money, when they build something, when they do something for you. But as far as like taking money, they like to keep that quiet. Unless they're like going after somebody, they're taking money from somebody you don't like the rich, in which case they appeal to your baser instincts of greed, envy, resentment, and so on. Okay. So here's a question I'd like to ask you. Who's greedy? Is it the people that want free goods and services at somebody else's expense? or is it the people who want to keep the money that they earned? Often I'll hear like, oh, the rich are so greedy. They don't want to. They don't want to part with their wealth. You know, that's theirs. It's their property that they earned, and they assume that all like the taxpayers are greedy bastards who want to pay as little as possible, and the tax consumers are all noble and good. But to me, like if you want something for nothing, that's greedy to me. That's like, and it doesn't matter if you just get a little bit. It's like, well, I want this, and I don't have to work for it. I want it out of somebody else's pocket because the government doesn't have any money of its own. They're always getting it from somebody else. Yeah.
Well, a lot of people would have bagged up some of the services. Like, I know one of my friends, she got food stamps. Her family got food stamps, and her little sister almost died. But when they got food stamps, she was able to bring her sister back to health.
And what did the sister like malnutrition or what?
It was malnutrition.
So there, I don't know the particular situation, but I mean I know like here in Eugene, there's like churches with food pantries. The college has a food pantry. It's all like donations. There's Food for Lane County. There's Eugene Mission. There's soup kitchens. There's Catholic Charities. So there's lots of private charities that don't have to take money from the government that give away free food. Is it like a really rural area?
Yeah. So like those are the people that need those kind of services. Like it's a big city, but like we didn't have a lot of resources to get to, and a lot.
Did they have like friends, relatives? I'm just thinking like if I had a kid that was literally like having health problems and malnutrition, I give that to my mom to take care of. I've got like neighbors, I've got coworkers. So there, I think people automatically jump to like the government. If not for the government, you know, people would be starving to death. And my view is like the government breaks your leg and hands you a crutch and says, without us, you wouldn't be able to walk. That so in that case, I'd say I think there might be some places I'd say like in the United States, like Appalachia, where people live in dire poverty and everybody's equally poor, and it's, you know, and there's not really a good education system, but I mean, these days they're pretty rare, and even without like government payments to people with kids that they can't afford to support, there's lots of social services available in almost every community based on charitable giving. I would doubt that if payments to single mothers with kids they can't support, or sometimes there's two income families. Typically, it's single mothers. If that stopped tomorrow, I doubt anyone would starve to death. It may be that the private charity would have to take up the slack, and they might you know, charitable giving might increase too once people become aware of the problem. Yeah.
So I think my whole thing with this is like, obviously we gotta live in a society where it's like you gotta work. Like there's nothing inherently wrong with like wanting more. You know, I'm pretty humble. I want a small house. I'm not someone who desires a big mansion. If someone else wants a big mansion later on in their life, that's totally fine. But the issue is really it's just like that the top 1% controls 40% of the wealth out there. They own 40% of the wealth that's out there and stuff. And that means like for the average worker who's making that, they're making 330 times more than they are an hour, which I don't think they're working 330 times harder than someone is in 1 hour. And then the bottom 40% is only controlling 7% of the wealth. And like with the libertarian philosophy where it's like, you know, we have a free market and essentially, you know, you let the market control things, you know, where you vote with your dollar in a sense. So like if you control 40% of the wealth, then you kind of get to control how the markets are being controlled. You know, that's like almost half of the markets. Then as well as for government too, you also get a lot of control over government interference, you know, paying off politician lobbying, like you mentioned and stuff. So it's not really about like going outright capitalism or socialism. For me, it's more just like we need to like kind of regulate this, and I don't think we should be like going like, oh, you greedy rich people. But when someone's like controlling 40% of the wealth and they're just like such a tiny part of the population, it just like, to me, it just seems ridiculous. Why do we need like these like ridiculously like it's just like a stupid amount of wealth for like a few amount of people to control, in my opinion.
Well, I think you're, like, the word "we" there, it makes me a little nervous, like, why do we need this, why do we need that? I'd say, like, you talk about people controlling the wealth, but it's not like there's like this wealth tree out there, and people just go up and pick fruit, and there's some guy there with a basket and mechanical picker who's stealing it all. It's like people are producing wealth. It's not, they're not controlling it, they're creating it. And without
We
these,
see throughout the years, it's like steadily increased, like the 1% is controlling more and more. If you look at the polls and stuff, it's just like over time, it's just like the numbers show that it's.
but the total amount of wealth is increasing too, though. Like, the question
It's being
is,
distributed towards the 1%, and like the other bottom half is like not really seeing much of that wealth being like coming back to them. Is what I
well, that whole word distributed too, it assumes that there's this sort of like money blower that's kind of like pushing money into the air, and there are these guys with these like these big nets that are sort of grabbing all of it, and then there's like these poor people that, you know, are just like grasping little bits and pieces here. And that, it seems like there are some people that are really good at producing wealth, and there's some people that are really bad at it. And I think there's reasons for that. Like, it seems like it's really hard in America to finish school, to stay out of prison or jail, to wait to have kids until you can afford them, and to be below the poverty level. Because even with government minimum wage jobs, you could work a job, any job, and if you work, 40 hours a week, you won't be poor. And that seems like it's a surefire recipe. And if you look at people who are below the poverty level, sometimes people have really serious medical conditions, and sometimes, they're the exceptions, right? And those people, you might say, well, for those people they genuinely can't work, they have some serious medical condition, or what have you, maybe they deserve some help, and maybe it's okay to take money from other people and give it to them and not let charity do that. But the vast majority of people, you stay in school, you get a job, you won't be poor. You just have to work enough. And you look at people who are poor, they don't work 40 hours a week, and they have kids they can't afford. They have kids early, and they spend money on things like cars that depreciate in value and cost a lot of insurance, designer clothes. I look at my students and I look at my car, and like, my car is a junker. It's 20 years old. And I look out in the parking lot as a community college where people supposedly can't afford to go to rich schools, and I know these aren't all faculty cars. I see these muscle cars. They have nice paint jobs. Some of them have dealer plates on them. And I think, how are they affording these cars? And so people make bad decisions, and then they expect somebody else to sort of bail them out instead of living within their means and saving and going into a field that's actually going to pay something. I wouldn't recommend. Actually, philosophy is actually a pretty good field. You got to probably go to graduate school, and philosophers, I think, attract a certain kind of person. But if I wanted to make more money, I could have been a lawyer. I was thinking about that. I'd probably be a multi-millionaire by now and have a nice house. But I'd be working my ass off and going over contracts all day, and that's not my idea of like a nice life. Yeah.
When I worked at McDonald's, which is a minimum wage job, I knew a lot of my managers, they were struggling. They made more than me. They made $11 an hour. They were working 40 hours a week. There was this one girl, she was working 11 hours a week. They were, her and her boyfriend, who both worked there, both managers, both worked around $11 an hour above minimum wage. They were trying to get her through school, but they couldn't find a job. So she was graduated from school, couldn't find a job, was still working at McDonald's. They couldn't afford a house. They could barely afford a payment for my $3,000 car so they could get point A to point B. And there's a lot of stories at McDonald's like that. I knew someone who was a graduate. There were people working 40 hours a week who got kicked out of their apartment because they couldn't afford the apartment, the living situation. they're not making bad decisions, they just can't get back on their feet. They're living paycheck to paycheck, trying to feed their kids, trying to make the bills, and it's really hard.
Well, why did they wait till they got through school to have a kid? And I've never bought a $30,000 car. I paid $4,000 cash for mine.
There's a $3,000 car.
3,000? Oh,
It was
3,000. I thought you said
yeah.
30,000. Okay.
No.
Well, 3,000, that's reasonable.
Yeah. There's,
And they're making payments on it. Wow. So,
there was just like multiple employees.
But-
There's some people working full-time with a kid, but there's others who are just a college students working 40 hours a week, and they still had loans, they still,
Mhm.
I talked to a lot of people, and it's just really hard right now, especially since college is really expensive to go through, and you have to pull out these loans, which 30 years back, that was not the case.
yeah, another
College was
question.
cheaper.
Sure, why is college so expensive? And I'd say, like, you look at things that are cheap and you look at things that are expensive. And what's cheap? Like computers, right?
That's a private thing.
Cell phones. And it's like computers get better and better and the price drops more and more. If you look at things like healthcare and education, through the roof. And the more money that is put towards subsidies, the more expensive it gets, and the more you have to ride on loans and don't get grants anymore. And it's just inflation. Part of it is, and I'd say that it's because they're largely subsidized and largely run by the government, and keep out competition. And so there's no market forces to keep the prices down, and the schooling is a huge expense, and the student loan debt is a huge problem in this country. And largely, it's because of government involvement and subsidization of education. And the whole idea that you need a 4-year degree for a job is also perhaps a questionable assumption. Yeah.
So just to step back to the 1% idea, I understand that people should be able to make what they make, and that's okay. And yes, some people work really, really hard. Like, there are lawyers who make a lot of money, but their jobs aren't easy. But when my dad was working for Northwest Airlines before 9/11 happened, he was making really good money, blue collar job. And then 9/11 occurred, and the whole issue with, all the airline companies almost going bankrupt. Well, Northwest was one of those places. And they started laying off hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people at that company. My father was one of the people who got laid off. But at the same time, the CEO of that company was making thousands of dollars an hour. So I think that's the real issue. And it's not something that the government can fix. And that's why I think people sit back and are like, damn, those greedy people that make all this money. And it's because there are positions like CEOs of companies that are making just ungodly amounts of money per hour, while their workers are being either laid off, like my father was being done to, or are, McDonald's or Walmart or places like this where they're, making only minimum wage or only allowing part-time or not giving them medical care or all these different things, while the CEOs and the owners are making just fat cash. And that's the issue, but you can't expect government to fix that. And that's also part of the big problem is you have to hope that there's going to be some moral nature in the people who are running these companies to do the right thing, but a lot of times that's not what we see. And then as the small little people at the bottom, we feel hurt and ask the government to help us.
That's what I was going to say. I feel like going full capitalism just breeds more and more greed. And it seems like those people naturally want to get more and more money. Even if you say a competing market will bring down prices, I feel like that's also just going to bring down quality of prices. There's never been a history company that makes a good amount ever. It was like, hey, let's bring down our prices for our customers. Like no, let's see how we can bring down, so we can make more.
Oh, I mean, don't people, when you're like going out to buy something, don't you look for the best price?
Yeah, no, definitely. But
Well, why aren't you greedy?
Oh no, that's.
So this whole idea of like wanting more money, everybody wants more money. Now I'm the CEOs, like if I'm the CEO of a big corporation, any little mistake I make can cost the country like millions of dollars. Like for example, speaking of an airline, remember the the Asian doctor who got forcibly reaccommodated and like showed up as a YouTube video star. And you had this guy that I think it was I can't remember if it was the CEO or it's like some PR guy, but basically said, gave this kind of non-apology apology. And their stock just, it lost like hundreds of millions of dollars from that one press release, right? And then the CEO, I think that it was actually came from the CEO. And he made this one statement and it just made things a million times worse. And so when you're running a big corporation, every decision you make, there's millions of dollars weighing in the balance. And so you got to make sure you get somebody who's super good. Whereas if some line worker at McDonald's burns the fries, you just get a new batch of fries and you're out a few dollars. It's not going to make a huge difference. And that's why the CEOs are paid. The second point I'd make is like that's up to the shareholders. That's up to the company. If you don't like the company, you don't have to buy from them. But there's and not to say there isn't corruption in corporate America and that CEOs aren't maybe overpaid for what they do, but at that system, so you might look at that compared to some ideal world, and you could say, well, it sucks. But compared to every other alternative, it's pretty damn good. If you look at it compared with food riots in Venezuela, or even you look at a country like Sweden, which is, kind of like a mediocre little country. It's got some industry. It's got a mixed economy. Workers aren't very productive. People have a reasonable standard of living. They're being hit with the migrant crisis. That's their biggest problem right now. But people don't work very hard in Sweden. People don't really have much ambition. They don't really produce a lot, although they produce more than, say, Greece. There's a reason why all the major inventions, all the major cultural exports, all the major economic activity happens in America, and it's because of the capitalist system. And there's a reason why Europe is swimming in debt and declining, and has been since after World War II. And it has to do with the capitalist system, which has a bunch of crappy things that goes along with it, like overpaid CEOs, used car salesmen, telemarketers, right? You can go down the line of all the crappy things about capitalism. But then the question is, compared to what? Let me just hit a couple more points here. The other thing is, like, that person isn't taking from you. Like, there's this kind of fallacy, I think, that wealth is a finite sum, and that if some guy is making $10 million, that means that money somehow, if you weren't making $10 million, you might get some of that. And it's not necessarily true unless you're assuming the government's going to take it and kind of spread it out like, Robin Hood or something. The fact that he's making a bunch of money, it's not like he's controlling a portion of a pie. He's creating parts of the pie. And then he's also, the capital is also creating jobs for people. And you get the CEO spends his money or he invests it. So there's a sort of revolving cycle of capital where it eventually comes down to people living in the ground level. You get a job, a service job that supports whatever is going on on the production side. You can make as much money, maybe not as you want. I mean, there are certain limitations to how much you can make, but certainly there are some things you can do that will earn you more money or less money. If you go into economics or engineering, you're going to make more money. If you go into social work, art history, you're going to be making less money. And you can look up. It's publicly available on you can just go on the internet and Google what people make. And you can see how much people make in the middle of their profession, what peak earnings is, what you can expect to start, and people, you can pick whatever you want. If you're going to be an accountant, you'll probably be doing pretty well. If you want to be an artist or a musician, you're going to have a lot of hustle if you want to make a decent amount of money, or a writer for that matter. And it's based on your natural abilities, which I suppose is a crapshoot, depending on your genetics. But but also your ingenuity and hard work, and that's just up to you to how ambitious you are. And you look at rich people, it's one thing that's really interesting to me is that super smart people tend not to be rich. They tend to go in academia or some kind of like thing where they use their intellectual abilities. But people, I remember I was working at the Bear Road Motel when I was at Syracuse in graduate school, full scholarship, and I'm working at minimum wage as a hotel clerk. And this guy comes in, and he's like the owner, one of the managers. He partnered up with this guy who's a school teacher. The school teacher guy did like the books and all this sort of financial stuff. And this guy, I can't remember if he finished high school or not. I think he finished high school and he like dropped out of college this first term. He said he just couldn't hack it. And he was telling me he had great admiration for somebody like me who could understand philosophy. He said, I took a philosophy class. I had no idea what was going on there. I dropped out my first term in that philosophy class. That was the thing that I busted my ass trying to pass that class and flunked out. But this guy, he's a contractor. He's did construction, got his contracting license, and him and his friend, they fixed up this old motel by the freeway, and they're like millionaires many times over, and they're talking about buying apartment complexes, and they're doing super, super well. And so this guy, he's a multi-millionaire, and he's probably in his 30s. And here I am in my 20s, and I'm making minimum wage at a hotel. I'm like, well, who's the rocket scientist here? Who's the smarter guy? This guy that probably has 100 IQ, you or me with my, in the 150s, and I'm like working at minimum wage, trying to get through grad school, with the starting salary for professors, isn't that high. So that makes you think like you don't have to be particularly smart, or even start out with a lot of money. You just have to have ambition and have a plan and focus on something that has a track record of making money. The problem is not that people that people care too much about money, is people don't care enough about money. They don't think about it. They don't understand delayed gratification. People in America don't save money. There's this consumerist culture. People spend beyond their means and rack up debt. What about poor people? So we've actually been talking about this a lot. So a free society is a generous society. So in societies the societies without capitalist production, there's charity is very low, and what you can get from charity is a small amount because nobody has anything. Like, what's charity like in Venezuela or North Korea? Right, probably not too much. And so if you have a prosperous society, people that make a lot of money can give out of their excess. When people are just barely getting enough to get by, their charitable giving drops. And say you lose your job or you don't make very much, you're just on the margin. You probably know as a poor, starving student, you might say, well, I'd like to give more to charity, but I really can't right now because I'm just getting by. So if you have a just getting by economy where nobody has extra, charity is low. But if you have people making money coming out of their ears, I'll tell you, like I had season tickets to the opera, and there's the opera is supported by public funds. Sorry, not public funds, private funds. Like they get a little public money here and there, but largely privately supported. You have this big opera house in Portland, and I see all the people coming there in their suits and ties, and the women with the jewelry. There's people with a lot of money to throw around. And they don't just give it to the opera, they give it to soup kitchens and all kinds of the arts and all kinds of different charities. And why are people poor? Well, drop out of school, have kids too soon, substance abuse is a big one. You get hooked on drugs, alcohol, you end up going to jail, you have a criminal record, not necessarily something that's going to dog you forever, but it's a big hurdle. And so people, they have character issues, they make mistakes, they make poor choices, and that hobbles them later on in life. And often people have like 5 of these things, and they go into a downward spiral, and then they curse capitalism for their woes. And they look at some guy who's an accountant, and they just see him as some rich bastard that got lucky. When what that guy did was he picked a profession that's something he was good at and something he could make a decent living at, and he went into that over his love of muscle cars that he pursues on the side. A lot of people will stay in poor gang-infested, drug-infested neighborhoods and not move out, even though they could fit all their possessions in their junker car. But they have other reasons for staying there, and they don't have any ambition to go out and make something of themselves, go someplace that's better. And then just, lack of self-discipline might be might be a sort of lack of personal responsibility and self-discipline might be a coverall case for most cases of poverty in the United States. Now, if you're living in Somalia or Bangladesh, your poverty is probably due to the government, and probably it's not up to you, although you probably have some control over it. But when your country is hit with civil war, or they're living in dire poverty because of a crappy government system, and there's no opportunity, and there's no capitalist production, there's no businesses, foreign investors wouldn't touch your country with a 10-foot pole because there's no property rights. It's not your fault that you're poor. In America, this cornucopia of capitalist production, maybe starting out early on, you're going to just get by, but over time, if you find yourself, you're 40 years old and all you're qualified to do is take like an item with a barcode and go boop, boop across the scanner at Walmart, you might have made some choices that could have been better earlier in your life, and you got the rest of your life ahead of you. You can still make some better choices, but there's a reason why you're working for just above minimum wage, doing a job that is not a highly skilled job and doesn't require a lot of you. Let's take our break. 10-minute break, short discussion of healthcare, and then we'll review for the exam. let's finish up this thing on capitalism. So what's America's biggest health problem amongst children? Obesity. What is it like? What's the biggest health problem in Ethiopia? Starvation, right? People not obesity certainly. So although again there might be particular parents that are struggling, who are for whatever reason unable to appeal to the help available through either private charity or government assistance. But there aren't children starving to death in America. And they play these PSAs incessantly on the radio that say that 1 in 5 children are struggling with hunger. And I really like to see the studies and where they arrived at that statistic. And I think I'm guessing there would be it would be about probably the same place that the 1 out of 10 people is LGBT stat came from. It's just basically some activists trying to drum up support for a social problem. So anyway, just give you some perspective, and not to say there aren't problems with poverty in America, but the causes of poverty in America are very different than the cause of poverty overseas and in third world countries. And it's a matter of relative poverty versus absolute poverty. So in Ethiopia, you have absolute poverty of people not getting enough calories to survive. In America, there's relative poverty in that you're just getting by living in a modest house, and there's some, rich a-hole living next to you, or probably not living next to you, living across town in some fancy house, and you get pissed off about it, and maybe go out and commit some crimes, which is what Jordan Peterson says is the cause of aggressive crime. And that's the whole, there's a reading about the Gini coefficient. It's a video, but it's on the week 9 reading. And the Gini coefficient says basically violent, aggressive crime, property crime, comes from men who live in a society which has a big disparity between rich and poor, and there's no way for them to easily move up the ladder. And so what they do is they go for sort of the thug life, and they go out and commit crimes to get stuff and to look like a badass and attract choice females. So it's the long and short of his theory. So it's kind of interesting, though, that if you look at societies where people are equally poor, they tend not to have much crime. You look at societies that are equally rich, they also tend to have much crime. But you look at societies that have a big disparity between rich and poor, it encourages, it's highly correlated, like extremely highly correlated with high rates of crime. And the coefficient is something like 0.8, which is like super, super highly correlated. And some of the other things that people associate with crime are much, much lower, including like poverty. Like, so you can look at even like, if you look at, again, in poor neighborhoods, there's almost no correlation. You look at really rich neighborhoods, it's even less. And it's this place where there's a group of people and there's a wide range of things. And I'd say, rather than the dominance hierarchy, you might look at other things like envy and resentment, along with, I don't know, lots of other more complex things. So I'm not sure that's the answer. But it raises interesting questions. And I think what he presents there might be kind of like what you might call a conservative argument for redistribution of wealth. I think his idea was it can't get too out of control. So he seems like a kind of a moderate conservative who wants some checks on the growth and concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. So one of the things about unions, I'm speaking as a union member, I'd say, unions aren't angels, but the administration are usually the bigger bastards in the room. It's certainly true here at Lane. We'll see what happens in July. But the idea is that you get people who are very liberal in their politics, and they love unions, and those unions keep up American wages, they make working conditions great, but also unions are trying to keep out foreign competition, and they don't want their jobs shipped overseas. And so to the extent that you're doing that, you're screwing third world people out of economic development. So it's something to think about anyway, that this sort of having very strong unions with a protectionist mindset slows the process of globalization, which is the one thing we know that's helping out people in the third world. And Charles Krauthammer talks about this in his article, where he talks about how primarily people in the Democratic Party and Democratic politicians are trying to keep out foreign competition because they want to protect the American worker. And then, interestingly, this is kind of the Trump economic and trade policy, right? So, and this puts him at odds with the free trade Republican establishment, the kind of Chamber of Commerce Republicans. And it's a populist approach. The idea is that, well, American workers come first, and these other countries are screwing us in these trade deals, and we're going to get the best damn deal possible. And, you know, the American government exists for Americans, not for people in the third world. And we can be good trading partners, and their economies can still develop, but not at the expense of the American worker. And then socialist governments really keep people from starting businesses. You know, rates of entrepreneurship in socialist countries is just really, really small, because any business you start, it's going to be illegal. There's so many rules and regulations that are required that nobody can follow all of them. And if you want to start a business, you're probably violating a bunch of different laws, and people just don't want to risk it. And this the whole this big revolution in the Middle East. I won't ask a test question on this, but this guy, you know, what started these democratic revolts in the Middle East is some poor guy. This guy had a graduate degree, and he's trying to sell vegetables from a cart, and some government goons, confiscated or destroyed his cart, and then he made this big protest, burned himself alive, and it's sort of the spark that caused all these democratic revolts back in 2011, I think. So here's a picture. This is I guess it's Shanghai. And so this is, you look at China, and China's economy has just been developing like gangbusters, and it's because of capitalist production. Back in the 80s and the early 90s, they've embraced more and more of an economic model of market forces. Now, it's still a communist government, but the idea is they have kind of a totalitarian state with a capitalist economy. And one of the results is that the government boot on your neck is rests a little more lightly, because you can't have a capitalist system with an educated, obedient population. People have to have personal initiative for capitalism to work. People have to be competent at having very highly skilled jobs. They have to be educated. And when people get educated, they start to get smart about politics and start to figure out what the game is. And so I think economic development in China is going to lead long-term to some democratic reforms, and we're already seeing some of that there. And a burgeoning middle class, whereas before there used to be routine famines there. And certainly after, in the wake of the Cultural Revolution with Chairman Mao, millions of people starved to death because of their opposition to capitalism. India is another place where things are growing like gangbusters. If you needed tech support, you might have, been put in touch with a guy who says his name is Steve, and you know that by his thick Indian accent that his name isn't really Steve, and he's going to teach you tell you how to fix your computer. I remember I was in a hotel in San Francisco, and I was trying to get on the Wi-Fi, right? And I figured they just patched me through to the front desk. No, I got routed all the way to India to tell me how to get on the Wi-Fi. So this is a big thing now, and there's even medical tourism, people going to India for heart operations, right? So it's not just like buying cheap stuff at Walmart anymore. It's like medical tourism. It's outsourcing and not just telephone support, but like huge business projects that can be done cheaper and more efficiently there. Let's see. be mindful of the time. So you look at these legal issues, and this is like the third tier of things that come up in these social and political arguments. You have moral issues, empirical issues, and then legal issues. So at the federal level, socialism is unconstitutional. Now, state constitutions vary, but the federal constitution has what are called the enumerated powers of Congress. So it tells you what Congress can do. And there's even the 10th Amendment that says if it's not in the Constitution, Congress can't do it. There was arguments about the 10th Amendment, and the argument was, well, why do you need this? Why do you need this amendment? It's superfluous. It should be. And James Madison says, well, obviously Congress doesn't have powers that Congress isn't given by the Constitution, but Jefferson said, no, it's got to be in there. I think it was Jefferson. Somebody convinced the Congress to put that in there. And so control of the economy is not an enumerated power of the federal government. Now there's this, and it's also not a power of the executive branch. There's this little phrase that talks about regulation of commerce among the several states. And this just means regulation in the sense to make regular, or to prevent Arkansas from having a tariff on goods coming in from Oklahoma. So basically and it says, and with foreign nations. So tariffs against foreign nations are fine. Tariffs between the states, you can't have it. So basically it's talking about import-export taxes and maybe even embargoes and things like that. The government can do that. But there's this interstate commerce clause, and it's basically been used as license for any kind of regulation, but it was never intended for that, and it doesn't mean that objectively from the meaning of the words. But there's been a bunch of bad court decisions that have allowed that to happen. And this is one of the reasons why the federal government is so big and controls so much these days. But all those regulations fly in the face of the 10th Amendment, which says that if it's not in the Constitution, that Congress can't do it. There's even some guy, this is the case that decided interstate commerce can mean anything. Some guy was growing wheat on his property for sale in his own state. And that basically the court said, well, he might sell it to somebody in another state, so therefore it falls under the interstate commerce clause. And he hadn't, I don't think, he hadn't even, I'm not even sure if he was selling it. So his act was neither commerce nor interstate commerce, but the idea was the government can regulate him based on this interstate commerce clause. So if you look up history of the interstate commerce clause on the internet or Wikipedia, you can read all about the crazy court cases that have set precedents. 10th Amendment says, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So basically state and local governments can have regulations. You can have a socialist state like Massachusetts, California. That's okay, depending on the state constitution, but you can't have socialism on the federal level. And this is the idea of decentralizing power, which means that, you don't have some remote bureaucrat in Washington calling the shots. You can go talk to your state legislatures. And state legislatures usually have a real job on part of their state legislature job. They have to make an honest living in addition to being a politician. Same thing with your local city council people, certainly. And this is one of the reasons for the Brexit. People didn't want some bureaucrat in Brussels calling the shots for how they live their life in Britain. I just talked about this. The Interstate Commerce Clause and Necessary and Proper Clauses were used to expand federal power. And you look at the Federalist Papers, which tells you what James Madison was thinking when he wrote most of the Constitution and what people at the time were thinking. It tells you what it means, and it should be obvious to anybody that reads either the plain means of the words or Ballard to look at the Federalist Papers and historical things at the time that there's no power in the Constitution to control commerce. This shows you that most of the regulations in the Federal Register are unconstitutional, paradoxically. You look at the founding fathers on this idea of property rights. They saw they're really important. Socialism flies in the face of property rights. Socialism explicitly denies property rights. It says they don't exist and you don't have them. And again, by socialism, I'm talking about them in the Marxist sense. There's no private property. Everything's held in common. And even like some aspects of socialism, this idea of government control of the economy, explicitly flies in the face of the founding fathers and the Constitution. So James, Madison setting out this stuff, cribbed from Locke, right to life, right to liberty, right to property, and then this last one, the right to own a firearm, right? To support and defend them in the best manner they can, i.e. with a gun. John Adams. He thinks that property rights is sacred to the laws of God, and he thinks, so obviously if you're not protecting property rights, that's they're as important as the commandments not to covet. Soak the rich, we're the 99%, right? What does it mean to covet? It means to jealously desire something that belongs to somebody else. Thou shalt not steal, i.e. through taxation. And so the idea is that any free society has to protect property rights, or it doesn't have any freedom at all. And it's going to lead to a sort of cascading series of downward effects. Thomas Jefferson, it's the true foundation of government is the equal right of every citizen in his person and property and in their management. I'm going to skip over maybe a couple of things here. A lot of stuff that might seem like it's funded by the states actually comes from the feds. A lot of education money is that way. It sort of starts out in the federal government and then gets block granted to the states, but it's still federal money. This is dated. So here's Bush the socialist, right? Centralization of education, added this $1 trillion prescription drugs entitlement to Medicare, socialist healthcare system, tried to get rid of the Death with Dignity Act, so that's violation of states' rights, continue the war on drugs. So that's sort of like a central government calling the shots, telling you what you can do in your own state. I love this quote from Margaret Thatcher. The problem with socialism, eventually you run out of other people's money. And certainly you can see that in most European countries that are, they have what's called the sovereign debt crisis, where people are basically, all the European states are awash in debt. This is mounted up from low economic production and huge welfare states, and exacerbated now by the migrant crisis. And so that's going to continue to be a problem there, less so a problem in the United States, although the United States, by embracing the European socialism to a large extent during the Obama administration, racked up $10 trillion in debt, doubling the national debt. So that's, $20 trillion we have hanging over our heads that we have to do something about. Debt crisis in Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy. They're called, PIGS, the pigs. Are held up not by Germany anymore, right? Not by Britain anymore, now just by Germany. So, and I guess the Frexit probably fizzled with Marine Le Pen's candidacy going down in flames. So the debt is just a huge drag in all those economies. And you look at the housing collapse and the subsequent economic collapse in the U.S., and that's basically caused by socialist housing policies. And we'll talk about that in some more detail in a minute, do the review. Oh, see, this is an old number. I think it's 20 trillion now. Should look at the debt clock. I had a link to the U.S. debt clock. I think we're 20 trillion growing. I am not sure what the GDP, but I think the government debt and GDP are hovering around the same number, so that's worrisome, right? If your debt, like if you're making $50,000 a year and your debt is $50,000, you're in economic trouble. And the government is still, borrowing between 500 billion and a trillion. I think more towards half a trillion than a trillion. But at one time, they're borrowing $1 trillion every year, or even over a trillion. Yeah, I don't know what the projected deficits are. So, and the big problems are these entitlement programs, Medicare and Social Security. And the problem is so when Social Security started, people were like dying around age 65, right? Which is when you start getting the benefits. That was the average age at which somebody kicked the bucket. So you think, well, you're gonna hand out government old age pension at age 65. On average, you're gonna be dead, you're not gonna collect anything. So, there was 40 workers for every one retiree. And so it's kind of a Ponzi scheme, but it's going to work, right? If you have 40 people, 40 working people supporting one non-working aged person, that's going to work. But over the years, what happens is people are living longer and longer and longer, and they're retired for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And so now today, there's 3 workers for every one retiree, right? That gets a little more dicier, right? If you got 40 people pulling the cart and 1 person in the cart, that's easy to do. If you got 1 person in the cart with 3 people pulling it, that's a lot harder. And the numbers are just going to get worse as people live longer. So that's a huge problem. And it's what you call it. If you did this in private business, it would be illegal. It's called a pyramid scheme or a Ponzi scheme, where there's no underlying asset, but you're merely using new investors to pay off the old investors, and there's nothing there. This is what Bernie Madoff went to federal prison for. The federal government's doing this. They're running a pyramid scheme, and the idea is they're taking money from you and you and you and you to pay for my retirement. By the time you retire, the question is there going to be any money left, right? When it's like maybe 1 retire for every 2 workers, what are they going to do? Cut benefits, raise the retirement age. They're already talking about that. Maybe you'll have to wait till you're 70 to retire. You might not give as much money, right? So, all right, I guess that's it. Healthcare, oh boy. I'm going to rely a lot on the readings on healthcare here. I want to go over the study guide. Just come to the readings here. Oh, I'm in the wrong term. Week 9. So look over these videos. Just talking about like the effects. People tend to look more favorably on communism and socialism than fascism. So you see Jordan Peterson's in these videos, and he talks about people come to his rallies with a banner with a hammer and sickle, and the difference people don't feel a problem, proudly showing that symbol of an ideology that killed tens of millions of people. But if it was a swastika, it'd be really different. And he talks about this sort of disconnect of people between these ideologies and what their real world effects were, and anti-capitalist ideologies. And both Nazism and communism are both anti-capitalist ideologies, which had a lot in common. Again, the question is it national socialism or is it worldwide socialism? As it was the big difference there. And he talks about utopian thinking, which is something I raised earlier on, thinking about, okay, well, this sucks, but compared to what? So if you see something that's bad, the question is not like how it looks compared to some ideal vision of the way you think the world should be, but it's compared to what's possible. And that's maybe one thing that separates out the more sort of conservative thinking versus the liberal thinking, is the concessions to reality. And this kind of utopian thinking can have dire consequences. We talked a bit about this Gini coefficient, which is that crime happens in areas where you have disparities of wealth. So here's a nice little tidbit. I suppose you don't want to laugh at anybody's death, was this sort of ironic death where the former head of the British National Health Service government system dies waiting for an operation. So in some ways, I suppose you might say this is great because it shows that people at the top don't get treated any better than people on the bottom. And even though she has a place of privilege, she suffered the same fate as some other schmo dying waiting for an operation. But still, it seems like that you get a lot of these effects in a socialist system where there's no profit motive, there's no incentive to take care of people well, there's no competition, and so you get your operation when you get your operation. And healthcare outcomes in socialist countries, excuse me, tend not to be as good. So people, especially if you have some serious problem, you need an operation, people who have money will often come down from Canada or they'll come in from another country to see a specialist. And even for things like MRIs. So if you have some dizziness and nausea and you think you might have a brain tumor, might be benign, might be malignant. In Canada, in some rural areas, you put your name in a hat. This is like a medical lottery for you to go get your MRI. Whereas in America, even though it's more expensive, you can see it right. You can usually get in right away. And when it's some serious condition and you need to see a doctor, often waiting will be the difference between something being treatable and something being beyond treatment, particularly with cancer. Let's see. Oh, so is healthcare a right? I think that one of the basic things here is like, is healthcare a right? The question is, what is a right? And generally speaking, things that people think are like natural rights are things that you can do. It's an action you can perform. It's not a thing you're provided. So it's a thing that you can do, and to say you have a right is to say that someone would be wrong to prevent you from exercising it. So if I have a right to free speech, that means I can say whatever I want, and it's wrong for someone else to prevent me from doing so. If I have a right to freedom of the press, it means I can publish whatever I want, and it's wrong for someone to prevent that. And to say that I have a civil right to do that is to say it's wrong for the government to do that, or the government can't do it. The same thing with freedom of speech. Freedom of religion means I can practice whatever religion I want, or no religion. And to say it's a natural right, to say that it'd be morally wrong for someone to prevent me from exercising my religion. To say that it's a civil right is to say it's wrong for the government to prevent me or to mandate me to practice some religion I don't want to practice, and so on. Right? So to have a right, it's just something you can do. Now, does that mean the government has to provide me with a house of worship, or even with like a prayer room, or with a holy book? The government have to print Bibles and Qurans? No. Does the government have to give me a megaphone for my protest? Give me materials to make my signs when I go out with my big anti-Trump protest? No, I got to do that myself, right? But what all the government does is they allow me to freely march, and if someone tries to prevent it, they give me police protection, say. Not always. Depends on what your cause is, I guess. So this is this big debate. Is healthcare a right? Well, for healthcare to be a right, it seems that somebody else has to provide it for you, which makes it different than lots of other rights. So, and this is the distinction between a positive and a negative right. So a negative right is a right that someone else doesn't have to provide you for. So you have a right to free speech and a right to assembly and a right to freedom of religion. Those are all negative rights. A positive right is something like, FDR's four freedoms: the freedom to work, right? Well, freedom of work means somebody has to provide you for a job. Either if a business doesn't provide it, FDR will give you a job with the WPA. or some make-work job and then give you enough money to live on. Let's see if I can, did I mention the 4 freedoms here? I think one of the freedoms was old age pension, right? So he says a person should have the freedom to live in old age without worry about being able to be supported. So he said you have a right to old age pension and the government's going to provide that for you. So that's very different than the right to free speech. So there's a big question about whether health care is a right in the same sense as you have a right to freedom of speech. So Bernie Sanders says it's a right and not a privilege. And he also points out too, so the idea of a privilege is something that, you know, it's nice to have, but it's something you don't have a moral right to or a political right to. It's just something that makes you better off. But that no one has an obligation to provide for you. You have to provide it for yourself. Or maybe, you know, somebody other than the government can provide it for you, but it's not something you're entitled to. That's a privilege. And so he says healthcare is a right. It's something that you have, that the government has a moral obligation to provide for you. And then he points to all these bad outcomes in the American healthcare system. So I figure equal time to Bernie, who was a big advocate of socialized Medicare, or as he likes to call it, socialized medicine or Medicare for all. The opposite end of the spectrum, Leonard Peikoff from the Ayn Rand Institute says that basically you can't have a right to health care because that means that you have a right to somebody else's money, and it's morally wrong to take from someone else to provide for yourself. And although you can, charitable organizations can do this, you can ask, you can provide for other people on a voluntary basis, but it's wrong for you to do it involuntarily. And he says that basically there's not a difference in kind between healthcare as a service and other kinds of services. For example, you need food to live, right? So does that mean the government has to provide everybody with food? Well, no. But there's this idea that let's see. Oh, here it says the right to life does not mean that your neighbors have to feed and clothe you. So he actually goes to the right to life. And so the idea is that you can have voluntary agreements with people, but you don't have a right to other people's resources. And then I have this thing about John Mackey, who talks about his solution to the healthcare crisis. And Mackey he runs what he calls a consciously capitalist business. So he wrote this book called Conscious Capitalism. He's a big libertarian guy, but also he cares about the welfare of his workers, and he thinks that basically CEOs need to care, and they need to care about the welfare of the workers. And he says, his company is not just about making money, it's about providing value for not just his customers, but also his workers. And talks about some of the things that he's done in a concrete way to offer healthcare to his workers, and how this was done universally, it would solve our healthcare problems. And basically the idea is give people medical savings accounts where they can save money for problems that come up, fee for service, make it tax deductible when you have a healthcare plan, that you can deduct it from your taxes. Because currently you can deduct, your employer gets to deduct the cost of your healthcare plan if they provide it for you, but you can't do that as an individual. Get rid of laws that keep people from competing against across state lines. That's why this first healthcare bill that's been passed, the sort of repeal and replace bill, why it failed, because it didn't have this selling across state lines. So you get these states like Oregon that say, if you have health care, it's got to cover all these things. The psychological counseling, abortion, transgender reassignment surgery, just like there's a long list of things that it has to cover, and that makes everything really expensive. It's illegal for anyone in the state of Oregon to say, well, here's a plan that just covers cancer, serious accident where you like lose a limb, serious medical condition, you know, freak neurological disease. There's like a list of things. And anything else you got to pay for yourself. It's illegal to offer a plan like that in Oregon. You have to have all this stuff. So it's not rocket science to see why the premiums have gone up so much, because there are all these state mandates. And also you can only sell to people in Oregon with a certain, you know, thing. And so lots of people are pulling out of Oregon. I think Blue Cross Blue Shield used to even provide for lane employees, and they've picked up states and they're not offering plans anymore. So look over that laundry list of things he thinks would help things. Ann Coulter, you know, conservative firebrand, basically says, my plan's called the free market, and thinks that if just people were unhampered by government rules, the premiums would come down, insurance would be insurance and not, you know, like an HMO or something where insurance would be insurance. And just long and short of this, I think I talk about this in my article. Insurance is for something that is unexpected, super expensive, that you couldn't ordinarily afford in one shot. So it's something that's unusual and unexpected, unaffordable, and maybe those are two different things. Unusual, unexpected, and unaffordable. Right. So maybe those three things. If I'm missing something here. If your house burns down, right? You don't plan for your house to burn down. Well, just buy a new house. Well, but this house cost me $150,000, $200,000, right? I don't have $200,000. So you pay a little bit to the insurance company in case your house does burn down. And so the idea is you do the same thing with like getting cancer, being crippled in an automobile accident, right? So the idea is that you pay a little bit each month, which you can't afford, in case something really bad happens, right? Like just like car insurance, right? You plow into like a brand new BMW that's being taken off the lot, and you're insured. You're not suddenly owing $60,000 to somebody, or whatever BMWs cost these days. Okay, so let's. I want to talk about. I'll just leave this up for a second. Short review session. Just gonna look at my. Actually, I think I can call this up. It's probably not worth the time. So the economic boom and bust. What caused the big? There was a big economic crash in 2008, 2009, just as we're changing leadership in the White House, and basically the cause was the housing crisis. And the housing crisis was caused by the government forcing banks to make affirmative action loans to poor minority borrowers that didn't have the credit for it, didn't have the income, and in some cases didn't even have a job. And the government was guaranteeing all these loans. And so what happened was the banks were stuck with all these bad loans and decided to package them as investments and sell them with the good name of Uncle Sam behind them. And so when the bottom dropped out of this market, when interest rates inched up a little bit, the whole thing collapsed. And it caused reverberations in the world. It affected world markets because a lot of people bought these crappy investments. They're called mortgage-backed securities, which the underlying asset was loans to deadbeats with houses that were worth way more than they paid for them because the prices kept on going up and up. And you get this thing where you give bad loans to deadbeats to buy houses, and then also there's this buying frenzy, and then people are like flipping houses, and the prices just go up and up and up and up, and people are buying houses they can't afford, and then pretty soon somebody realizes something's wrong here, and then some people start to default on these loans that they can't pay back, and the whole thing collapses. And so, what caused this? Was this too much capitalism? Well, actually, no. It was these socialist housing policies that were supported primarily by the Democratic Party that said you need to give loans to poor people that can't pay them back, otherwise you're a bad person. And it's particularly bad if these people are minority borrowers in minority neighborhoods. And so the housing crisis was caused by a government housing program. It led to a big bubble and then a burst and cascading effects throughout the economy. And then the Obama administration came in and basically bailed out all these bad actors. Like there was an insurance company called AIG, which took a big hit, I think $40 billion, and they got a bailout. GM got a bailout. All these companies which engaged in capitalist excess and took these terrible risks. Many of them got bailouts from the federal government, including foreign corporations. So that's where you sort of have capitalist risk and then socialized consequences. And that's sort of the worst of both worlds. Let's see what I can hit in our remaining minutes. A lot of this stuff is fairly easy from the reading. Let's see. Bill Burr's taxing parable. What's the point of it? Well, he gives us the example where a bunch of people go to dinner and people expect the rich guy to pay. And then the next day, the next time they go out to dinner, the rich guy doesn't show up. And basically the idea is that if you soak the rich, you're going to drive capital overseas, and you're going to make people unwilling to pay their fair share. If you and the other idea is that if you sort of if you demonize people that produce the wealth in the country, you're going to drive them away. Because there'll be a way to encapsulate that. There's a section on what is money, and that's a handout I gave. We talked about a lot of this today. There's some things like, what is class struggle? So class struggle is this idea in Marxism that you get these class antagonisms between the haves and the have-nots. And there's been various kinds of class struggles throughout history. And the one going on now is between the worker and the capitalist, the business owner. And one of the things, the problems that Marx had is that he didn't foresee the rise of the middle class. So over time, you get this rise of people in the middle, and this sort of bifurcation of the have and have-nots kind of is still around, but it's ameliorated by a large middle class. And so you don't get the revolutions that he expected. And the results of these of the socialist revolutions in various countries have always been dismal. I don't think you can point to one where people are better off afterwards than beforehand. Maybe some people, but the country overall tends to be in more dire poverty than it was before the revolution. We hit all these. Sovereign debt crisis. One of the things, there's a little article in Sweden, and basically the long and short of it is that Sweden isn't the socialist workers' paradise that most people think it is. It has a large amount of capitalism in it that people don't pay attention to when they look at the economy as a whole. All right, next week we'll have honors presentations.